Tennessee's death row is a place of waiting, where time stretches on as appeals fade and execution dates draw closer. Tonight, we're looking at the prisoners who remain under death sentences in Tennessee, men whose crimes shocked communities, whose cases dragged through decades of appeals, and who now face their final reckoning. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss our deep dives into the stories of those on death row and the chilling history of America's executions. Donald Ray Middlebrooks. They say evil doesn't always come from the shadows. Sometimes it comes from someone you least expect, hiding behind an ordinary face. In the spring of 1987, Nashville would learn that lesson in the most horrifying way when a 14-year-old boy named Carrick Majors never made it home from an afternoon walk. His disappearance set in motion one of the most chilling murder cases Tennessee has ever seen, and decades later, the man responsible is still waiting for his reckoning. It began like any other weekend. Carrick, a bright and outgoing teenager, was known in his neighborhood as a kid who loved basketball, family dinners, and hanging out with friends. That Saturday, he stepped out for a short walk. He never returned. Hours passed, and then a full day. His family knew something was wrong. Carrick wasn't the kind of boy who disappeared without a word. Panic spread through the community as police were called in and search parties combed the area. The investigation moved quickly, and suspicion soon fell on a 21-year-old man named Donald Ray Middlebrooks. Middlebrooks already had a reputation. He was troubled, unpredictable, and had been in and out of trouble with the law. But nothing in his past hinted at the sheer savagery of what he was about to unleash. When detectives pieced together the events of that night, the details were almost unbearable. Middlebrooks had kidnapped Carrick, taking him to a remote spot near a creek. There, he tortured the boy in ways that investigators later struggled to even describe. Carrick was beaten, stabbed, and mutilated before his life was finally taken. The brutality was so extreme that one seasoned Nashville detective admitted he had never seen anything like it. He said it was pure sadism. The community was shattered. Parents clutched their children a little tighter. Fear rippled across neighborhoods where people once felt safe letting kids roam. The Majors family was left in ruins, one moment preparing for Carrick's future, the next plunged into a nightmare no parent should ever face. Middlebrooks didn't stay free for long. Police zeroed in on him with evidence and witness accounts. When he was arrested, he showed little emotion, as if the gravity of what he had done barely registered. In the courtroom, the details came pouring out: gruesome photographs, expert testimony, and the chilling truth of a crime that seemed to have no motive beyond cruelty. Jurors sat in silence, some holding back tears. The trial was swift. In 1988, Middlebrooks was convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and torture. The jury had little difficulty deciding his fate: death. Tennessee's law at the time gave him a choice between lethal injection and the electric chair, and though the years have blurred, the sentence stood firm. Middlebrooks would one day face execution, but that one day has stretched for nearly 4 decades. Middlebrooks, like many on death row, turned to appeals. His lawyers argued over constitutional rights, trial errors, and his mental state. Each attempt was struck down. The crime was too brutal, the evidence too strong. Year after year, Carrick's family sat through hearings, waiting for justice that always seemed to be pushed further down the road. In 2025, Tennessee set an execution date, September 24th. It was supposed to be the end of a story that began in blood and grief nearly 40 years earlier. But just as the clock ticked down, the court stepped in again. A stay was granted while federal litigation continues, delaying the inevitable once more. For Carrick's family, it was déjà vu, hope, then heartbreak all over again. The weight of time is heavy in cases like this. Middlebrooks is now in his 60s, having spent most of his life behind the walls of Tennessee's Riverbend Maximum Security Institution. Carrick never lived past 14. His future was stolen, his dreams extinguished in a night of unimaginable cruelty. And yet, decades later, the state still wrestles with how and when to carry out the punishment. For the people of Tennessee, the case of Donald Ray Middlebrooks remains one of the darkest chapters in the state's history. It's a reminder that the death penalty isn't just about punishment, It's about time, process, and the unending pain of families caught in the middle. Carrick's name is carved into memory, not for who he might have become, but for the cruelty that ended his life. As for Middlebrooks, his fate hangs suspended between two possibilities: a final injection or the electric chair. Both methods wait, but until the courts finish their last words, he remains in the shadows of death row. And while his story is chilling, it is not the only one. Another man sits on Tennessee's death row, his case tangled in years of controversy and questions about what really goes on behind prison walls. His name will soon come up, and when it does, the story only grows darker. Henry Eugene Hodges. When people think of death row, they often imagine cold-blooded killers who committed one shocking crime. But then there are men like Henry Eugene Hodges, whose life is a long trail of violence, crime, and destruction across multiple states. For Tennessee, his name has become synonymous with both brutality and endless courtroom battles. The story that sealed his death sentence began in 1990. Ronald Bassett, a telephone repairman just doing his job, crossed paths with Hodges during what was supposed to be a routine day. Bassett never made it home. Hodges attacked and strangled him during a robbery, killing him in cold blood. It wasn't a crime of passion or a split-second mistake. It was deliberate, and it fit the disturbing pattern of Hodges' life. Because Bassett wasn't Hodges' first victim. By the time he was tried in Tennessee, Hodges already had blood on his hands from killings in both Georgia and Tennessee. He was a man who seemed to move through life, leaving chaos and corpses behind him. Prosecutors painted him as a predator who saw human lives as expendable. The jury didn't need much convincing. In 1992, Henry Eugene Hodges was sentenced to death for Bassett's murder. His execution method, by law, would be lethal injection, though like others sentenced before 1999, he could request the electric chair. Either way, the sentence was final. But Hodges' story didn't end in the courtroom. In many ways, it only became more bizarre. On death row, Hodges became infamous for his behavior. He launched appeal after appeal, raising arguments about his mental health and the conditions he was kept in. At one point, he claimed severe depression and mental illness made him incompetent to be executed. Now, the courts had to stop and evaluate whether a man who killed without hesitation should now be spared because of his own fragile state of mind. Even prison guards and medical staff weren't spared from his chaos. Hodges made headlines in 2007 when, in a disturbing act of self-mutilation, he removed part of his own body while behind bars. The incident shocked even seasoned correctional officers and further fueled debates over his mental stability. Some saw it as proof that he was deeply disturbed. Others called it another manipulation to delay justice. Decades later, Hodges remains on Tennessee's death row. His execution has been scheduled and rescheduled, each time tangled up in legal motions, psychiatric evaluations, or debates over lethal injection protocols. For the family of Ronald Bassett, the wait has been unbearable. They've spent more than 30 years wondering when or if the state will finally carry out the sentence. Hodges' presence on death row highlights the contradictions of capital punishment in America. On one hand, he is a convicted murderer many would say clearly deserves his fate. On the other, his long record of appeals and mental health issues keep raising difficult questions about the line between punishment and cruelty. For now, he waits. The electric chair sits in storage. The lethal injection chamber remains ready. And Hodges, a man whose life has been defined by violence and self-destruction, continues to sit in the limbo of death row, watched closely by guards who know he can still shock them even after all these years. But Tennessee's death row doesn't end with him. There is another man whose date with death is now officially set, December 11th, 2025. His name is Harold Wayne Nichols, and his case will remind us just how long the shadows of the past can stretch. Harold Wayne Nichols. Some crimes don't just scar a family, they scar an entire community. In the late 1980s, Hamilton County, Tennessee was shaken to its core when two women were brutally murdered, their lives stolen by a man named Harold Wayne Nichols. Decades later, his name still lingers in courtrooms, in prisons, and in the quiet grief of those left behind. And now, after years of appeals and legal wrangling, Tennessee has circled a date on the calendar, December 11th, 2025, the day Nichols is finally set to die. It began with violence, the kind that never fades from memory. Nichols was no stranger to trouble with the law, but in the summer of 1988, he committed crimes that would define him forever. Among his victims was a woman named Karen Pulley. She was just 21 years old, full of promise, with friends who described her as warm-hearted and dependable. On the night she was attacked, Karen had no reason to suspect she was in danger. Nichols followed her, cornered her, and subjected her to a brutal assault that ended with her death. And Karen was not alone. Prosecutors later revealed that Nichols' history included other attacks, rape, assault, and violence against women. The crimes painted a chilling picture of a predator who saw opportunity in vulnerability. For Hamilton County, the trial wasn't just about one murder. It was about a pattern of cruelty that demanded justice. When Nichols was arrested, the community's relief was tempered by the horrifying details investigators laid out. The evidence was overwhelming. Forensic testimony, eyewitness accounts, and the consistency of his prior assaults all pointed to a man whose violence wasn't a mistake, but a choice repeated again and again. During the trial, jurors listened as prosecutors described how Karen fought for her life, how Nichols ignored her pleas, and how her body was left behind as if her life had no value. It was unbearable testimony, and the courtroom often fell into stunned silence. The verdict was swift. Nichols was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. The judge, echoing the jury's decision, declared that the brutality of the crime warranted Tennessee's harshest punishment. In that moment, it seemed like closure might be within reach for Karen's family. But death penalty cases are rarely so simple. For more than 3 decades, Nichols remained on death row, filing appeal after appeal. His lawyers argued over technicalities, the fairness of his trial, and even his eligibility for execution. At one point, his legal team claimed that executing him would be unconstitutional, citing his personal history and mental health. The courts listened, debated, and delayed. And with each delay, the families of his victims were forced to relive the nightmare, attending hearings that brought old wounds back to the surface. Years turned into decades. Nichols grew older inside the walls of Riverbend Maximum Security Institution. His victims, forever young in memory, became symbols of lives cut short. For the families, time did not heal. It only stretched the wait for justice further. Then in 2025, Tennessee officials finally announced what had long been postponed. After exhausting all of his appeals, Harold Wayne Nichols would face execution on December 11th. For those who had waited nearly 40 years, it was a bittersweet announcement. Justice, delayed for so long, was finally within reach, but nothing could ever bring Karen back. The method of execution is one more haunting detail. By default, Nichols will die by lethal injection, Tennessee's primary method. But because of when he was sentenced, he retains the option of the electric chair. For a man who once wielded violence against others, the decision of how he will face death now rests with him. The weight of his story is not just in the crime itself, but in what it says about the system. For decades, Tennessee struggled with how to balance justice and due process, how to ensure fairness while not forgetting the victims. For Karen's loved ones, every year of delay felt like another betrayal, another reminder that the system often moves slower than grief. And yet through it all, they kept her memory alive, refusing to let her be defined only by the man who killed her. As the date approaches, Nichols' name will once again fill headlines. Commentators will debate the death penalty, lawyers will scrutinize the appeals, and reporters will gather outside the prison gates. But inside homes in Hamilton County, families will think about Karen, about what she might have become, about the birthdays and milestones she never got to see. For them, the execution isn't about politics or legal theories. It's about the empty chair at the table that has been there since 1988. Harold Wayne Nichols lived most of his adult life under a death sentence, his fate delayed by time and technicalities. Now Tennessee has set its course. December 11th, 2025 is a date that carries the weight of decades, a date that promises finality in a case that has stretched far too long. Tennessee stands out for its willingness to resume executions after long pauses. While some prisoners fight on in the courts, the clock ticks toward the state's chosen methods, lethal injection, or the electric chair. For Middlebrooks, Hodges, and Nichols, their stories serve as stark reminders of how the justice system moves: slow, relentless, and final. If you found this breakdown compelling, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Which of these cases struck you the most, and what do you think about Tennessee's use of the death penalty today? Thanks for watching, and stay tuned as we continue uncovering the haunting stories from death rows across America.